All right, so navigating clinical trials. So we got a little bit of time constraints, so I'm going to go through some of this a little bit more quickly. I think that the key message here and the theme that you're getting is that clinical trials is how we're going to take things to the next level. And I'm not going to talk too much about clinical trials themselves because I think that once you get to the clinical trial, things go pretty easily. You get a great team around you and they help you navigate, okay, how am I going to go on to this study? The challenge is, how do I get to that clinical trial? That's what we're going to talk about. So these are my disclosures. So you see there's this kind of maze navigating to get to that clinical trial in the middle. How do we get there? In 2016, I think we're really used to the idea of technology. You know, you have a GPS, you pull out your Google Maps, you pull out your Waze. I'm going to go somewhere, it's going to be easy to get there. I think in terms of clinical trial navigation, where we're at nowadays looks kind of like this. And how many of us remember that old school road map that you'd kind of pull out in the car and you're kind of turning it upside down, trying to figure out? I think that's kind of where we're at right now in terms of how we're accessing clinical trials. And we'll talk about some of the issues in that regard. All right, so the objectives. So I wanted to give you a general overview of clinical trials. Talk a little bit about the common myths that I think are the barriers for patients going on to clinical trials. Talk a little bit about why I think clinical trials are important for my patients. Okay, so clinical trial, medical research study of something new and promising. And I think the key thing, especially in lung cancer, is that we're not talking about just new and promising treatments. We're looking at new and promising ways of testing lung cancer, identifying different oncogenic drivers. So it's not just all about treatments. And the treatments, you know, a lot of people have this kind of idea that clinical trials are basically something that I brewed up in my basement one night and then I bring it to the clinic the next day and, you know, I'm going to use that on my next patient. These treatments have gone through years and years of preclinical research, so lab research, animal research, a lot of things that, you know, we use to try to make sure that this is going to be the best option to bring into a clinical trial for our patients. We'll keep going. All right, and ultimately, clinical trials are going to be what leads to new treatments. So we have standards of care. Our standard of care treatments are good treatments, but they don't take us where we want to go. We need to get to the next level, and trials are really the only way that we're going to get there. All right, so you guys didn't come from all across the country to hear that. That's pretty obvious. You knew that. What can we learn? All right, so clinical trials, the basics. So everybody's heard, you know, there's phase 1, there's phase 2, there's phase 3, there's phase 4. Often people say, well, I don't want to go into a phase 1 trial. That's like a really new trial. I want to be in a phase 3 trial. Well, what's the difference? In big kind of broad terms. So when you move from, we'll just kind of advance, when you move from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, phase 1 studies are generally smaller studies, generally looking at safety of a new drug, generally looking at trying to nail the dosing, you know, what's the right dose to be used in terms of going forward in studies. Phase 2 is typically where you say, okay, I think I know the side effects, I think I know the dosing. Does this drug work in a specific type of cancer? And then phase 3 is really the proving ground, where you kind of have, it's almost like boxing, where you have the heavyweight champion, so that's your standard of care, and then you have the challenger, and you want to see, can they wrestle that belt away to say, you know what, I'm going to be the new standard of care if I can beat up on the standard that you're using. Phase 4 studies, those studies are generally studies that are done once the data has shown that there is a benefit, but often we're looking to see, okay, we did a study in a few hundred patients, we know the drug works, we've seen some of the side effects. What happens if you roll that into a group of 1,000 patients? Do you see different side effects? The other really cool thing of phase 4 studies is it's a way that we can access drugs for our patients. So often there's a lag between the time that we get data that a drug is effective to getting Health Canada approval, to getting funding, and these are studies that we can open as a way to enable our patients to access a medication. Perceptions about clinical trials. I think these are very interesting to see. So there's a large study done of over 10,000 people in the States. What are your perceptions of clinical trial, both in terms of the negative as well as in terms of the positive? So this is the perception about the risk. So number one, people are worried about side effects. It makes complete sense. These are new drugs. We don't know everything about them. So, you know, what are the side effects going to be? How is this going to affect me in terms of my overall health? Well, we won't talk about it that much in the interest of time, but the issue of will I get a placebo, will I get a sugar pill in the trial come up? And the reality is that's very limited. That's for a select type of trial. For the majority of trials, that's not what we're looking at, but certainly a valid concern. In terms of the benefits, why do people think that it's important to participate in clinical trial? And it's interesting because the first two perceptions is, number one, it may help advance the science and the understanding of this disease. It may help improve the lives of other people. And when I talk to my patients about clinical trials, and very commonly they'll mention these reasons, I'll participate because I think it's going to help somebody else, which I think is fantastic. I always tell them, I say, you can have your cake and you can eat it too. I think it's really important. You're doing this for you to try to make sure that we get you a good treatment, and it's fantastic that this is going to help other people as well, and they both really go hand in hand. All right, so myths and reality of clinical trial. Why is it important to talk about myths and reality? The reason it's important is because most people don't participate in clinical trials. So the statistics for all medical conditions, if you got 100 patients, only 3 out of 100 patients are going to participate in a clinical trial. And in lung cancer, it's even less than that. The thing that's also a little bit sobering is that most people don't even know that clinical trials are out there as potential options for them. So many patients don't hear about clinical trials. So there's a lot that's out there that in kind of popular culture in terms of clinical trials, a little bit of a bias, and I want to debunk some of those myths. So I think the most common myth that we hear, a lot of people will express this, people who go into clinical trials are guinea pigs or lab rats or something like that. And I think there's two key things to say about that. Number one, on the slide, the word that we're using here is volunteers. These are people who are going and saying, you know what, I want to help myself and I want to help other people. And I think that there's nothing that's more noble than kind of pursuing that sort of endeavor. So the idea of somebody being experimented on is completely the wrong connotation. The second thing is, how many people in the room remember the first man to walk on the moon? All right, so most of us. I don't think I was around, but I saw it on YouTube. So, if you think about Neil Armstrong, I was about to say Lance Armstrong, but it's the wrong talk. If you think about Neil Armstrong, would somebody say that he was a guinea pig? Would you say that he's a lab rat? He was an explorer. He pushed boundaries. He was a test pilot. I was reading a blog that somebody wrote about their clinical trial experience, and they basically said that, I want to be seen as a test pilot, that kind of fighter pilot who's getting into that supersonic jet. It's a little bit scary. Not a lot of people can do it. But that's what I'm going to do for myself. And I think that's really how we have to envision clinical trials and change the dialogue in that regard. The facts are also that, often people kind of think, okay, I'm being experimented on, there's nothing else that you can do. Clinical trials may be the best option above sort of standard of care therapy. So it may not just be a last resort for people. And they really could be good options at any stage of disease. This is just a quick example of the power of clinical trials, and I think that a lot of you in the room are kind of living and breathing testaments to this. So this is my first patient in clinic on a Monday a year ago. So 67-year-old guy, never a smoker. He had stage 2 lung cancer. He had surgery, got it taken out, had adjuvant chemotherapy, but unfortunately 6 months later it had come back. And we sat down, we had a discussion, say, what can we do for your situation? The obvious option, you've kind of heard this theme already, chemotherapy. We could give more chemotherapy. What could we do outside the box? Well, there was a clinical trial that was available. The first clinical trial that was available was something called the COMPACT study, and you hear all these names thrown around, Octane and COMPACT. But this was basically a sequencing study. So this was a few years ago. Can we get more information about your cancer so that we can try to target it better? So he said, sure, we just end up taking the tumor, sending it off for some mutation testing. Why not? So he enrolled in the study, and it showed that he had a BRAF mutation. So he's got this new mutation. It's not one of the common mutations that we deal with in lung cancer in Canada yet, so emphasis on the yet. But basically, we found the kind of switch that turns his tumor on. He had the BRAF mutation. We said, you know what, why don't we consider you for a phase 1 clinical trial? So again, for many people, this would be counterintuitive to say, why would I want to go on to a phase 1 study? These are new drugs. They're very early in their development. So we put him on a phase 1 study of a BRAF inhibitor commonly used in melanoma, excellent tolerability, and he had stable disease a year later. So this just kind of highlights both the idea that a clinical trial doesn't necessarily need to be a trial of treatment. So in order to get the treatment, he had to get the testing. We were able to do that. And then a phase 1 study, which again, we typically think about as being very early, maybe not applicable to most people. This was actually his best option. He's doing fantastic on it. Another myth, clinical trials are dangerous. And, you know, I can't highlight enough that certainly we respect side effects. Safety is the #1 concern in terms of anybody going on a clinical trial. But the idea that somebody's kind of taking their life in their hands and kind of going into a study, again, I think that's something that's out there in kind of popular culture. I think the narrative needs to be changed. So safety is a top priority. There's oversight at many, many different levels in terms of patient safety. So both in terms of both in terms of Health Canada, both in terms of institutions that are conducting studies, in terms of the investigators and the clinical trial nurses that are doing the studies, people are very closely monitored on clinical trials. The reality is that people who are on standard of care treatment, they actually don't have the same oversight. They don't have the same kind of multiple sets of eyes that are kind of looking at things, crossing T's, dotting I's. So clinical trials actually are quite safe. When you think of standard of care therapies, while chemotherapy is a standard of care, chemotherapy can have side effects. And we think we've gotten really good at delivering it over the years. But certainly chemotherapy is something that we respect. And if we can do a clinical trial and look at a drug that's perhaps more effective, look at a drug that's less toxic, again, that takes away that clinical trials are dangerous type of narrative. All right, another myth. Anybody know where this is? Sorry, who's that? Key West, well done. So Mallory Square in Key West, that's fantastic. Anybody know who the picture is? Who the guy in the picture is? Okay, I wasn't really expecting. That's me actually. So that's how I feel in clinic on a busy day. There's kind of multiple, torches. Sometimes they're flaming, sometimes there's not. But life is busy, and we as doctors get pulled in many different directions. And there's this myth out there that if there's a clinical trial that's good for me, well, of course my doctor is going to tell me about it, and if they don't tell me about it, then probably means that it's not applicable. So this gets cut off, but on good days I wear a shirt. So we're all human. I think of myself as always trying to, as Roz said, we look ahead at our patients. We try to think, okay, what's changed? Is there something we need to do differently? Is there a trial that's applicable? But we're all human, and sometimes we'll forget. So we'll skip that, but most people don't talk with their doctors about clinical trials. We talked a little bit about this before, this idea, this myth that, I'll participate in a clinical trial, but I'm not going to benefit. It's really for other people. I think the highlight is that, and this is, what you just heard from Ian, clinical trials give access to the latest drugs and procedures. And certainly this story is very much similar to your story, but it's a patient who was 68 and he was a smoker. So we talked a lot about targeted therapy, immunotherapy. So he was 68, he had stage 4 disease, he was told that he needed chemotherapy. He saw somebody, wasn't really very enthusiastic about the idea of chemo. He said, are there any other options? And he was told no. So he sought out a second opinion. He ended up at our center, and we happened to have a clinical trial open, and it was a phase 2 study of immunotherapy. At the time, it was a drug that just was kind of alphabets, MPDL32808, but it's now FDA approved. It now has a name. It's atezolizumab. He went on this drug 3 years ago. He had a complete response, and he's doing fantastic. So again, the idea that clinical trials are applicable at all stages of people's disease, and the idea, and we'll talk about this in a moment, of really trying to push the question in terms of saying, is a clinical trial the right option for me? So here's a question. How many immune therapy agents are currently approved, or actually I should say currently funded in Canada in 2016? None. So this is a segue to Dr. Lail's talk, but there's 0 available. We know they work. We know that they're approved in other areas. So how do we access them? Well, one of the ways that we access these drugs is through clinical trials. So, we all at our centers, we all have studies of immune therapy. So the list of all the immune therapy drugs that are out there. And this is also how we've accessed targeted therapy. So for ALK-positive patients, how we've accessed ceritinib and how we've accessed alectinib, and then osimertinib. So again, what you're getting from this discussion, it's really tying together the McAlpine story in terms of how we access these drugs, and it's going to segue into what Dr. Lell's going to talk about in terms of accessing treatments. And then others, so these emerging things, so ROS and RET, and I've got ETC at the bottom. It's a new gene that was discovered called etc. So how do you find a clinical trial? So I actually kind of did an exercise, and I unfortunately didn't have enough time to complete the exercise, but I'll tell you what I did. I basically took off my medical hat and said, try to envision myself as a patient or as a family member, as a caregiver, who needs to find out about a clinical trial for a certain condition. How easy is it to do that? So you go to Google, how do I find a clinical trial that's right for me? When people are surveyed, it's interesting. About a quarter of people say they're very confident about, I can find the right clinical trial. Half of people said that they're somewhat confident. I was actually surprised by that. There's a lot of different ways that you can try to find clinical trials. If I want to find, can I get onto a clinical trial? There's databases, so you can go online, you can kind of Google stuff, you can go into databases. There's actually this really cool matching services. So there's, again, online databases where you can kind of put in your demographics, put in, do I have an EGFR, do I have an ALK, have I had first-line treatment or second-line treatment? They also have phone consultation. I actually wanted to do that. I was going to prank Lung Cancer Canada, actually, and call them up and see what they advised me. I ran out of time for that. But advocacy organizations, again, you're kind of getting this theme, right? I called Lung Cancer Canada. I asked for help. I said, I need a clinical trial. What would you advise me? I think, though, that at the bottom, and I kind of highlighted this, ask your doctor and ask your doctor again. I mean, at the end of the day, the doctor is treating you is going to know your story the best and will probably be able to advise you. Now, obviously, if you get to a situation where you hit a brick wall, well, then, it's probably time to go ask for a second opinion. But in most situations, it's about starting the conversation. So clinicaltrials.gov is a very well-known kind of database of clinical trials. And I tried to do this search. So I put in lung cancer in Toronto. It's kind of highlighted in the red there. And I came up with about 400 results. And I'm pretty savvy at doing this, so I've done this before. So there's a little checkbox on the left that you probably can't see, but it says include only active clinical trials. So I checked that box, and then I got down to 87 studies that are open. Well, how am I going to figure out which of these 87 studies is going to be the right study for my situation? So there's the old school way, and again, I think there's no school like the old school. It's not perfect. We got to improve it, but you're your best advocate. I think that the people in the room here are a select group of people in terms of being able to be advocates, and I think what we need to do is kind of translate that energy into others who don't have that power, who don't have that knowledge. We talked about your doctor being busy, right? So it's that idea that you have to kind of push that conversation or kind of push that narrative. And the idea is really one question opens a whole discussion. So all it takes, sometimes you're in the middle of a busy visit and it's kind of like, oh, would a clinical trial be a good idea? And then you can almost see sometimes the light bulb go off. And this has happened to me also, where the light bulb goes off and you're like, yeah, let's talk about that. And it opens up a whole new dialogue. And I think with clinical trials, the one thing, imagine if somebody doesn't know that there's a T790M mutation. Imagine if somebody doesn't know that there's a clinical trial and they can't go to the States. Well, then what happens? And the thing that you never want to hear, and certainly the thing that I would never want to hear for a friend or a loved one, is this idea that there was a study a few miles away, or in Ian's case, a few hundred miles away, and you never know. Or this idea that why didn't anybody tell me about this? That this was an option. So Lung Cancer Canada website, I think they did a fantastic job. So you've got a little button on the bottom for clinical trials. You've got peer-to-peer networks. These are some of the ways that in Canada we can really kind of learn from each other and learn from kind of our national advocacy organization in terms of where the clinical trials are at. and how to get on it. So we're not going to really talk about, I said, we're not going to really talk about the clinical trial process itself. This is obviously what we want to happen. This is a new drug. This is what we want it to do to a cancer cell. I don't want to minimize the clinical trial process. It's a scary process. It's hard to navigate. It's hard to know where to go. So how do you choose the right one? When you actually show up and you start investigating a clinical trial, it's a little bit daunting. They put this like sheet of paper in front of you, like 100 pages long. That's scary. They tell you about any and every side effect that imaginable that can happen to you. And at the end of the day, some of the trials are complicated. It's kind of like a computer is going to decide what happens, and then there might be 3 different paths that you can go on. This isn't an easy road, but at the end of the day, for many people, it's still the best road. And the questions that we need to ask, both as doctors, both as patients, is does this give you the best chance? And if it does, I think you jump in and you go for that clinical trial. At the end of the day, clinical trials aren't going to be for everybody. I think you need to be comfortable with the choice for a study. But if you kind of say, you know what, this is going to give me the best chance, that's the route to go. And I think what we need to do is we need to get the message out that for a lot of other people who aren't getting these opportunities, that's the best route for them to go as well. So my take-home messages, and when I made this slide, I didn't realize that there was a built-in pun. So for those baseball fans, they remember Josh Donaldson taking home. I didn't intend the take-home message in that regard. But clinical trials lead to new therapy, so that's kind of obvious. But I think that if we want to break through and break over that barrier where we're stuck at with our standard of care, clinical trials lead the way. They can be excellent options in all lines of therapy. So even if somebody hasn't had any treatment, is a clinical trial right for me at that point in time? In Canada, and Canada is not unique, a lot of other countries are struggling with access to drugs, especially access to expensive drugs. The way that we can access some of these new and really promising and exciting drugs is through clinical trials, so targeted therapy and immune therapy. And as I was saying in the slide before, that it's not an easy process, but there's help. And I think that a day like today is certainly a great starting point in terms of getting that message out to the rest of the country. So thanks very much for your attention.